Hey everybody, I'll be there in a second. Just finish getting all this set up. Hey everybody. Oops, I want to mute that. All right, everybody, welcome to the Yaron Brook Show from live from Singapore. I am here in Singapore. Last show I did was from Hong Kong, and Stephanie mentions I look better rested. Yeah, I mean the one from Hong Kong I did in the middle of the night in Hong Kong, and this one is in the morning. So it is 9:27 a.m. in Singapore right now, and so yes, I'm well rested. Thank you, Stephanie. And I thought I'd do. We talked today a little bit about Singapore, about my impressions here. I did a really cool event last night. Here, maybe a little bit about China, and let's see how far we get. I still owe you. I know I owe you a review or some comments on Game of Thrones, and I'd like to do that at some point. And we'll see if we get to that today or not. So here we go. My first time. By the way, the background, for those of you on video, background is my hotel room. So you can see a mirror, so you can see the back of my head, and you can see most of the room through the mirror. So that's kind of the background. When I travel, I often use. You often see my various hotel rooms. This is a really nice hotel in Singapore, and Singapore's pretty amazing. So let's talk about Singapore. I arrived here a couple of days ago. Singapore is ranked typically number 2 in the Economic Freedom Index, right after Hong Kong. It is just ranked number 1 in the world in terms of competitiveness by some survey in terms of business competitiveness. It is generally considered one of the freest economies in the world, and it's kind of ironic because if you talk to objectivists and free market people here in Singapore, they constantly complain about the level of government intervention in the economy, the level of government involvement, the level of government projects, the amount of government money the government spends on a variety of different projects, primarily, in a sense, beautifying the city and all kinds of real estate projects and parks and things like that. And all of that is true, but in comparison, it is pretty amazing. In comparison, it is far freer than many other countries. Let me just switch audio source because I think we can get better audio. All right. Whoops. One second. We're almost there. There we go. I think this is better audio, so I apologize for that. So it's all relative, right? It's unfortunately capitalism is the unknown ideal. It is unknown ideal anywhere in the world. It does not exist in Hong Kong. It does not exist in Singapore. It certainly does not exist in the United States of America or in Western Europe. It is still, as Ayn Rand identified when she wrote the essay in the 1960s, it is still the unknown ideal. And my job, our job, all of our job is to fight for the realization of that ideal over time. And, but there's an amazing correlation. It truly is stunning, and visually so. You can actually see it. It is a stunning correlation between the amount of freedom that is allowed, particularly the amount of economic freedom that is allowed, and the economic success of a particular country. So Singapore is a stunning place. It is one of the richest places on the planet on a per capita GDP, although there is a lot of concern here about so-called income inequality. People are generally quite well off here. You can tell by the cars driving around in the streets. I mean, it's quite stunning, and I mentioned this to my host. It's quite stunning, the number of BMWs and Mercedes-Benz and Audis, and if it's going to be a Japanese car, it's a Lexus. It truly is quite stunning, the amount of wealth that people have in Singapore. The number of multinationals that have offices here, headquarters here, the number of banks that are headquarters here. This is really, together with Hong Kong, the two gateways into Asia, the two financial centers that allow business to do business in Asia. It is economically a freer economy than the United States is. The Singapore government spends about 17% of GDP. The United States federal government spends about 20% of GDP, but then you have state governments and local governments, and if you combine all of that, it starts approaching 40% of GDP. So 40% of GDP in the United States is spent by the government. And somebody on the chat is calling Singapore fascist. Really? The United States today, it has one of the most statist, interventionist economies of the developed economies. It is quite horrific. It has been ranked in the last 5 years as low as number 18 in the Economic Freedom Index. Singapore is number 2 in the Economic Freedom Index. And freedom is freedom. I mean, I'll take economic freedom. It's better than zero freedom. So politically, Singapore is what is called semi-free. There are elections. There are opposition. There's an opposition party. There was actually a member of one of the opposition parties was at my talk last night. And but it's been the same ruling party since Singapore achieved independence in the 1960s. But there is real concern about what people are thinking. The government is actually, unfortunately, I think, engaged in moving to the left on economic policy and reducing economic freedom in an effort to actually appease the opposition, to appease the pressure from people voting for the opposition. So there is kind of democratic, if you will, pressure on the government to move towards easing some of the concerns. The concerns, unfortunately, are the wrong concerns. The main concern seems to be this issue of inequality, which, of course, as you know, I have written about, I've spoken about, is, in my view, a completely bogus concern. But let me just say this. I mean, it's amazing. You look at the skyline of Singapore. It is stunning. It is beautiful. I mean, the most beautiful skylines today in the world are in Asia. I would say that Hong Kong, Singapore, and Shanghai have probably the most amazing skylines in the world today. Singapore is. You see a lot of new development, a lot of new buildings. There's a lot of construction. Now, granted, a lot of that construction is being done by government. Government is way too involved in the economy of Singapore. But if it's too involved in the economy of Singapore, what must we say about its, the heavily involvement of the U.S. government in the economy of the U.S.? It manifests itself differently. So in Singapore, for example, there's very little regulation of business as compared to the United States. But in Singapore, the government gets much more involved, at least much more involved in investments. So the Singapore Wealth Fund, the country has a fund that it invests. Thank God the United States does not have that, and there's been a lot of talk about taking Social Security and investing it in the stock market, or the government investing Social Security funds, or creating a sovereign wealth fund for the United States. I mean, that would be a massive disaster. Singapore has such a wealth fund. Norway has such a wealth fund. Of course, the Arab world states have such wealth funds. Very unhealthy to start getting the central government involved in investment in financial markets. It can be long-term quite disastrous economically. So a lot of unhealthy trends, if you will, in Singapore. And again, capitalism is an unknown ideal, and we're fighting for capitalism. Free speech in Singapore, to some extent, is restricted. But again, I'm here, I'm speaking. I gave a talk yesterday. I said a lot of controversial things. Nobody is attempting to silence me. So yes, there are restrictions. I don't want to be Pollyannish about what's going on here. Yes, the government is way too involved in the economy, in education, in what people can and cannot say. Singapore is far from an ideal country. But then, if you look around the world, every country is a mixed economy. Every country is mixed politically. Every country out there has real threats to liberty, is unfree in some significant ways. And, that is true across the spectrum. The nice thing is, I'd say this historically, that the nice thing is that there are very few countries in the world today that are truly ruled by authoritarian, closed systems. So as compared to 40 years ago, there are only, really 2 or 3 countries today that you cannot leave, North Korea being one, Cuba being one, Iran being somewhat, where the government establishes totalitarian control over its people. The number of states like that are limited. There's more than one. There's probably 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5, and it's varying degrees and varying levels of control. But nothing as compared to what it was when the Soviet Union was still around. Nothing in Asia compares to what Mao Zedong's China was like. So when you travel around China, what you notice is, and I think what everybody should notice is, how much freedom there is as compared to what there was just 40 years ago. Instead of focusing just, there are 2 ways you could look at this. We could just focus on the lack of freedom. We could just focus on the negatives. We could just focus on what's missing. But that I think is silly, and it's freedom is rare. Freedom is unusual. Freedom is historically the exception. And when we find freedom, even pockets of freedom, even partial freedom, we should celebrate that. And then we should fight for complete freedom. But to focus on the evil, to focus on what's bad, to focus on what's wrong, that's just hopeless. And I've said this before, and I think it's so important to hold in your mind today. We live in the best period in all of human history for human life, in terms of our material well-being, but also in terms of freedom, at least in freedom across the world. There's more freedom today in the world than ever before. Even China. You can focus on the ways in which the Chinese authorities are authoritarian. Certainly the trends are not good in China. China's moving in the wrong direction. But China is 1,000 times better and significantly freer than it was 40 years ago. What we need to fight are the trends away from freedom. What we need to fight is for capitalism real capitalism, capitalism as, the unknown ideal, the ideal of individual rights, the ideal of actual freedom. So I'm excited about being in a city that's clean, that's generally well run, where the traffic is not too bad, and where people are still creating and building stuff. Now, there are real consequences to government involvement in Singapore, and the consequences are not so much economic, because, as I said, I think on a GDP per capita, Singapore is one of the richest countries in the world. I think number 3, and from a lifestyle, from a quality of life is very high in Singapore. By the way, there were a number of people at my talk yesterday who were Americans who'd moved here and who live here and really enjoy living here. Probably the cost that Singapore pays for its for the control, for the statism, for the level of government intervention is probably more in it has more to do with the individual's ability to live a successful and happy life. I think it has to do with their willingness to take risk. It has to do with their ability to be creative, and their willingness to be creative. The relative lack of entrepreneurship, the relative lack of risk taking, the relative lack of building successful Singaporean businesses. Most of the businesses here that are successful are foreign businesses that have come in. So there is a real spiritual cost, I think, to living in an environment where the government plays a big role in the culture and in the way people live, as it does in Singapore. There is a cost in there's a cost in people wanting to be safe rather than in people willing to take risk. And one of the things you observe about, I think, the differences between Hong Kong maybe and Singapore, Hong Kong is a messier place. Hong Kong is a dirtier place. Hong Kong is a more difficult place, I think, to live, and there's more friction. But Hong Kong is also more of a risk-taking culture. Hong Kong has more of an entrepreneurial attitude to it, and partially is that the government in Hong Kong is a lot more hands-off and has always been a lot more hands-off. Now, again, that's changing in Hong Kong. It's moving in the wrong direction. I've expressed my pessimism about the direction the world is heading, I think, on the show I did last time. So the world is definitely heading towards more statism, and you can see that everywhere you go. Everywhere you go. It's still good to celebrate the positives, to celebrate the success that occurs and that is happening. You compare these countries in Asia to Eastern Europe, and I mean, they're so much richer. They're so much more they prosper so much more. And of course, Singapore and Hong Kong are great examples of why you don't need natural resources. They're great examples about what you actually need is just leave business alone. Create the rule of law, protect property rights, respect contracts, and let business create wealth, and let people retain that wealth. Don't tax it all away. Don't steal it all away. And when you do that, you get these massive successes. I mean, Singapore is a little island off the coast of Malaysia. Malaysia, overwhelmingly Muslim country, still a relatively poor country. On the other side of Singapore, across the sea, you can actually see the lights. You can see Indonesia, another relatively poor country, one of the largest Muslim countries in the world in terms of sheer size of population. And here's this little island with the majority Chinese, where basically the government has allowed business to be free, to left alone from most regulations. Taxes are low, has created a safe environment. The government is doing its job in terms of safety. It's doing a job in terms of protecting property rights. It's doing its job in terms of protecting contracts. And boom, I mean, the economy here is an incredible success story. It's an incredible success story. It could be better, but this is an amazing place for the most part for people to live. Food here is fantastic. The only thing my main concern about Singapore, put aside the politics, my main concern about Singapore is the weather. It's right on the equator. It's a little north of the equator, I think, a few miles. It's so hot and humid here. Oh my God, it's so hot and humid. That is rough. I mean, it makes Puerto Rico, where I live, seem cold and dry in comparison, which is quite amusing. Singapore has an interesting history. It was a British colony for a long time. It was occupied by the Japanese during World War II. So the fact that it was a British colony is what kind of allowed it. It's what brought in, at least initially, kind of the idea of the rule of law. It's what brought in the idea of property rights, and is that heritage. It's what brought in kind of. Somebody was telling me that what they teach at the universities in terms of the philosophers that have influence are the more Anglo-Saxon philosophers. And that makes sense. It brought in that British tradition of thinkers, which is far superior, for example, than the kind of continental tradition of thinkers, the German and French. So it is based on some healthy foundations. The British were here until the 1960s, early 1960s, when the British left and Malaysia became independent. Singapore became part of Malaysia. Then there were political differences between Singapore and Malaysia, so Singapore kind of spun off and established its own state. It was ruled by the founder of Singapore, and he basically took many of the good elements. Lee Kuan Yew, who was the founder, who was considered the founder of Singapore and responsible for all the success. Indeed, Singapore went from being a developing to a developed country in one generation. That is what relative free markets can do. That is what just having some capitalism can achieve. He took a lot of the positive elements of British rule. The same can be said of Hong Kong. Hong Kong and Singapore are two examples of successful British colonization. It's the exportation of the British rule of law. It's the exportation of British respect for property rights that has allowed Hong Kong and Singapore, and through them, I think the rest of Asia to some extent, different degrees, to absorb and ultimately to absorb these principles and then to succeed economically. It's those principles that have led to the economic success in China, to the economic success in the rest of Asia, to the economic success of the Asian tigers, to a real fundamental level. It is those British ideas of property, of respect for the individual, of respect for freedom, at least up to a point, right? That has allowed Singapore and Hong Kong to thrive, and by extension has allowed Taiwan and South Korea, kind of the Asian tigers, to be successful, and ultimately to allow China to be economically successful. When you apply these principles, I mean, this is the great thing about, the mystery in life, and why it's so frustrating, because you can travel around the world, and where these principles are applied, you see economic success. Where these principles are not applied, you see economic failure. And yet, does anybody learn? Are these principles the principles that are guiding the future of humanity, or guiding the future of countries? No, it's the opposite. Everybody wants more statism. Everybody wants more government intervention. Everybody wants to move towards socialism, in spite of the fact that when statism and socialist principles are applied, they fail. And when capitalist principles are applied, they succeed. And it is so frustrating to see the amazing success that is Singapore and Hong Kong, and to know that the people in power are undercutting that success by moving away from those principles. One of the interesting things about Singapore, where they have not respected property rights, is, for example, property. So just like Hong Kong, and I didn't know this about Hong Kong, but just like Hong Kong, in Singapore, all the land, all the property is owned by the state. And all the buildings, all the skyscrapers, everything in Hong Kong and in Singapore is basically there by lease. So they are 99-year leases. In Hong Kong, somebody told me the only like 3 properties that are actually what are called freehold, where there's actually the owner has title on the ground. One of them is the church in Hong Kong. They cut a deal with the British a long time ago, and they actually bought the land. They actually own the land. But in Singapore and in Hong Kong, the land is owned by the government. It is leased out. But in Singapore, it's one step further. In Singapore, almost all housing, I think something like 80% of housing, is owned, built by the government. So the government has taken a big role in housing, again, I think to try to reduce the cost of housing in an attempt to, to reduce the angst that the poor might have. But of course, the housing is also middle-class housing, because if you're doing 80%, it's most of the 80% of the population lives in government housing. And therefore, the government is building middle-class housing. It's quite unique. I don't think there's any other place in the world that has a robust, healthy middle class and upper middle class where they live in government housing. So that's kind of uniquely Singaporean. I mean, what you learn when you travel around the world, again, is to the extent that free markets are practiced, to that extent, you have economic success. And to the extent that they're not, you do not have economic success. Anyway, last night we had an event at a WeWorks, in a nice space at a WeWorks in the close to the financial area in Singapore. And we had, to my surprise, we had over 70 people. We had over 70 people. The organizers of the events, of the events for me in Singapore, are young. They are, they're relatively inexperienced. The activity of objectivism and objectivists and capitalists and pro-capitalist, this is a relatively new project here in Singapore. It's really, to me, it's so exciting to meet young objectivists in a completely new region for me of the world, who are active, who are engaged, who are interested, and who want to promote these ideas. And their first event was a huge success. They got more people than they expected. More people that actually registered in advance showed up, and it was a very robust audience. There were a lot of questions. There were a lot of challenges. There was a lot of back and forth. I think it was a great first event. We're doing another event tomorrow on Saturday, where it's going to be more of a discussion, debate with another person. And the topic is going to be inequality. Yesterday it was capitalism. I think we're off to a great start here in Singapore. I think there's a lot of promise in what is possible in the future. So, again, I'm excited about Asia, about our potential in Asia. One of the things that Asia has, I've said this in the past, but it's worth, I think, repeating. One of the things that Asia has as an advantage is that it doesn't have Christianity. It doesn't have Jesus on a cross looking down at you, telling you you need to be guilty. Now, Singapore is quite Christian, so maybe that's not quite true, but it doesn't have a history of Christianity. It doesn't have a history of sacrifice. It doesn't have a history of entrenched altruism. And I think there's much more of a spirit, and I noticed this in China, much more of a spirit of individualism, much more of the spirit of the pursuit of happiness, focus on self, trying to get things done. And what they lack are the principles. What they lack are the ideas that make individualism, particularly moral individualism, the morality of individualism, possible, and the principles to help guide their pursuit of happiness. But they're not quite as encumbered as the West is by Christianity, and I think that is a huge benefit. And I think Hong Kong has that. I think even the Christianity in Singapore, I suspect, is a lot weaker and has a lot of a weaker grasp on people than Christianity does in the West. And certainly in China, Christianity is still a minor force in China, although growing. It is a minor force. So again, I think a big advantage that Asia has is the relative lack of Christianity in it. And I think part of the success of the more Chinese parts of Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and then maybe the other parts that haven't been touched by Western religions like Islam and Christianity, Taiwan, of course is Chinese, but Japan and South Korea, relative to the most Muslim parts or the more Christian parts. Philippines is very, very Christian and very, very poor. Malaysia and Indonesia are richer and more successful than the Philippines, but they have a real Islam problem. They have a problem with radical Muslims. So I think that the fact that Western religions have not tainted this part of Asia is actually a massive advantage for these Asians, and that is kind of interesting. Okay, let me see if there's a question here in the super chat that is relevant. Okay, Alex, it looks like from Hong Kong, asked, was British imperialism mostly a good force for the world despite its bad elements? Is there something to be said for imperialism in this context? No, so I'm not an advocate for imperialism, qua imperialism. That is the idea of going to countries, occupying them, treating the populations, I don't know, second-class citizens or badly, as the British Empire did in many cases. Was a British imperialism a force for the good and a force for evil? Certainly, it had massive positive elements, and it has some really bad elements. I mean, there was a lot of injustice brought about by British imperialism. There was a lot of violence brought about. There was quite a bit of exploitation brought about by the British imperialism. In the early days, certainly in the 18th century, there was still a lot of slavery the British imperialism perpetuated. So British imperialism is certainly a mixed case. But to ignore the positives is a massive mistake and a massive misunderstanding of history. I mean, a place like Singapore, places like Hong Kong, even India, benefited enormously from imperialism, and the main benefit that they got were great educational institutions that were based on the English system and exposure to all the achievements that the West had achieved within those Western educational institutions. They benefited from the rule of law and a respect for property rights. They also benefited from the direct application of technology into their economies, the railroads for example, in India, the ports that were built in Singapore and in Hong Kong, and British industry and British financial institutions coming into Singapore and in Hong Kong and creating robust financial institutions and robust financial markets. So there are massive benefits to British imperialism, to the spreading of good ideas. So with the violence, with the evil that certainly constituted a significant part of imperialism and is always part of imperialism, one shouldn't ignore the benefits and the pluses, and should recognize both the evils and the benefits. Even Alexander the Great's conquest of Asia was violent and horrific and imperialistic and disastrous in many, many respects. On the other hand, he also brought Greek philosophy and Greek ideas and Greek culture and Greek civilization to much of those countries around Asia, and I think was responsible for some real developments in Asian cultures, in Western Asian cultures, as a consequence of Alexander's conquest. So I'm always against violence. I'm always against conquest. I'm always against the sacrifice of your soldiers for the sake of conquest, particularly in the modern world. But one shouldn't ignore that when a civilization conquers places that are uncivilized, they leave a benefit there. The benefit is not worth the lives lost, but there is a benefit, and one should identify it. One should identify those pluses, and one should one should embrace the pluses. So it's a mistake for Asian cultures to say, oh, these ideas are British ideas, we don't want them. No, if they're good ideas, embrace them. These ideas are imperialist ideas, we don't want them. No, cultural appropriation is a good thing when you're appropriating. Cultural appropriation is this modern nonsensical term where you can't cook food of a different culture, you can't articulate ideas of a different culture, you can't participate in celebrations of a different culture, you can't embrace a different culture because that is appropriating what is somebody else's. It is a horrific, racist, tribalist mentality that thinks in terms of ideas, food belonging to a collective instead of and not something that individuals should be celebrating. So I'm a big believer in cultural appropriation. I'm a big believer in taking the best from different cultures and appropriating them for themselves, or using them in your own life. And I think the successful Asian countries are countries that have taken good elements from the West and implemented them and made them part of their culture. And I think you see that in Hong Kong, you see that to some degree in Singapore, you see that to some degree in Japan, in South Korea, in Taiwan, even in China. You see that. You see them have adopted certain elements from the Western tradition of ideas, and those elements are universal, and therefore they succeed anyway. We're all human beings. So this brings up, Jason asked, why is eugenics an invalid view? Because it's just invalid. We're all individual human beings. What's important is what makes us unique qua human. What makes us unique qua human is our ability to reason. And that is not dependent on the color of your skin or the shape of your skull or any of those things. Science should be studying the individual. Science should be studying the human brain and how it works, and the human mind and how it works. We should be thinking about how to improve our ability to think, how to improve our knowledge, how to discover more truth about the world out there, rather than investing in what differentiates us qua groups. Groups don't matter. What matters is you as an individual. And the shape of your skull, the color of your skin are insignificant features of your life. What you should be focused on, what's significant, and that is the content of your mind. So we should be studying. It's much more important to invest in psychology. It's much more important to invest in philosophy. It's much more important to invest in neuroscience, in understanding the human brain and understanding human success, in understanding what it takes to be a successful individual, and by extension to be a successful culture or a successful society or a successful country. But you have to start from the individual, understand from the individual. Society is just a collection of individuals. Groups are just a collection of individuals. So what we need to understand better is individuals. The science of eugenics is a science of racism. It's a science of tribalism. It's a pseudoscience, first of all. It's a pseudoscience of all of these things. And it's a pseudoscience focused on the wrong question. What is common to groups is not important. What is important is what is unique to the individual, and what is universal across all individuals. What is human nature, and how does that manifest itself, and how do we understand the capacity of human beings to reason? So eugenics is just an excuse to be a racist, and studying different races and stuff. I mean, I can understand it from an anthropological, historical context. Where did people move and what did they do and how? But to pretend that eugenics is gonna add anything to what I think we should all be striving towards, and that is truth, and that is ultimately providing the tools for individual happiness and individual success. It isn't. It does exactly the opposite. And it is an ugly, ugly, ugly field, and just the history of it should turn you away from it. Daniel asks, if an allied country that protects individual rights is under attack by an authoritarian country, is there a point where we should intervene? It depends, right? It's going to really depend. In general, the answer is no, but there are circumstances where the enemy that attacks the allied country is an enemy of ours where there's good enough reason to believe that once the authoritarian country might defeat the free country, they will come after us. There might be situations where we might have a joint defense alliance because it's in our interest, because we face a common real enemy. But generally, I would say that the answer is no, particularly when you are a strong country, where you are a country that is relatively immune from the authoritarian countries. So Ayn Rand was very, very much believed that the United States should not have been a member of NATO, that even during the Soviet Union, even when there was a common enemy, that Europe could defend itself, and if Europe didn't want to defend itself and couldn't defend itself, then it was Europe's problem, that the Soviet Union, in Ayn Rand's view, did not really constitute a physical military threat against the United States. The United States was too rich, too far away, too powerful to really have the Soviet Union as a real threat to its existence. She believed communism will ultimately collapse within itself, and that it couldn't really sustain an empire, if you will. And she was right. I mean, the Berlin Wall fell less because of Reagan and more because of the inevitability of the collapse of communism. Communism was bound to collapse at some point. It collapsed in China because of the own internal dynamics of China. And at the end of the day, it collapsed in the Soviet Union because of the own internal dynamics of the Soviet Union. Communism is a failed system, and it cannot feed its people. And that's ultimately what causes communism to collapse. So, no, I think for the most part, I don't think that it is necessary to send own troops to defend, again, unless the calculation is made that the enemy is a common enemy, and by defeating our ally, they will ultimately be in a stronger position to defeat us. So should America send troops to defend Israel? I don't think so, and I don't think it's needed. I think Israel can defend itself. I think does America need to defend Europe? No, I think Europe can defend itself. Should America defend Taiwan? No, at the end of the day. I don't think America should die to protect the freedom of the Taiwanese. And Taiwan is at a real disadvantage because of the sheer size of China. It probably would not survive a war with China. Right now, the United States has a defense treaty with Taiwan. So right now, the United States is obliged to defend Taiwan, just like the United States is obliged to defend Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania, just like the United States is obliged to defend South Korea and Japan. So the United States today has to go and defend an ally. But I think in a really rational society, I think those treaties would. I'm not sure those treaties would make sense. And I don't think that you could justify sending American lives and American treasure to fight for somebody else's freedom. So I'm for America spending its resources, military resources, financial resources, to defend itself. And that should be the entire focus of the government. This guy is saying, in science, when evidence shows the theory fails, the theory is abandoned. With so much evidence of socialism failure, why hasn't it been abandoned? I mean, if you listen to all of my talks, I really do cover this. It hasn't been abandoned because socialism is consistent with altruism. And altruism is the moral theory that people have accepted. And what is the standard of failure for altruism? What is the measure of failure? Also, what is the measure of failure economically? The measure for Marx was interesting, because for Marx the measure was ultimately happiness and ultimately material well-being. But most Marxists are not Marxists in that sense. And most people who advocate for socialism don't consider material well-being to be the standard, don't consider economic success to be the standard. They have some psychological version of capitalism creates alienation and socialism cures us of that alienation. And of course, socialism is never practiced purely. Therefore, socialism has never been successful because it's never been done right. But they don't necessarily argue that socialism will be more successful materially. What they argue is that socialism will create more social cohesion, all kinds of terms that mean nothing and impossible to measure and impossible to assess, right? But at the end of the day, it's all about altruism. And what is the purpose of altruism? What is the purpose of living for the sake of others? Well, it's not individual happiness, not individual success, it's not individual prosperity. So individual happiness, individual prosperity, individual success are not measures of success. The nice thing about science is the standard is clear. You're asking a particular question and you're evaluating what is the truth about this question. How does the world actually work? But when you talk about the humanities, and even economics to some extent, what you're talking about is not what works, not how the world works, but you're talking about what is right, what is just, what is moral. Now, I think there's truth there to be found, what is moral, but if you define what is moral wrongly, like what is moral is to sacrifice to other people, what is moral is the well-being of the needy, what is moral is the extent to which we sacrifice those who have ability to those who need. So the more we cause them to sacrifice, the more we tax them, the more we control them, the more we regulate them, the more moral we are, therefore the more successful we are. Then the measure is completely different. And then when we look at socialism, we don't see failure. We see, well, they tried to sacrifice those greedy capitalists to these poor, but corruption got in the way or something else got in the way and they didn't quite succeed in doing that, right? But they tried. And the suffering and the destruction are not viewed as negative. They're actually viewed as positive. They're viewed as signs that there was actually an honest attempt to actually bring about sacrifice. So it is ultimately altruism that shapes how we deal with scientifically with this question of socialism versus capitalism, right? Jose writes, altruism is the morality of cannibals. Yes, altruism is the morality of cannibals. Couched as a morality of benevolence and helping the poor. But of course it isn't. It's the opposite. It's a morality of destruction. It's a morality of sacrifice. It's a morality of negation of happiness and negation of the individual and negation of values. And that is where the battle is. The battle is a moral battle. The battle is about whether sacrifices are good, about whether selflessness is good, about that. That's the essence of the battle that we're engaged in. It's all at the end about morality and epistemology, because we have to know where truth comes from and how you discover truth and the source of truth. And epistemology and morality is what it's all about. And this is why I think libertarianism in its various forms have to fail, because economics and politics divorced from morality, economics and politics divorced from epistemology are meaningless. And people don't care. You're not going to convince anybody. It doesn't matter. Because the standard of success is not determined by economics and politics. The standard for what counts as success is determined by ethics. So if what counts as success is how many people have I sacrificed today? How many people have I taken based on their ability from and given people based on their need? Then socialism works. Now, the thing is that the altruists don't ever present altruism in its naked form, because people are too rational, are too good in some sense, to buy into altruism in its naked form. So they have to couch altruism in fluff. Altruism is being kind, and it's being nice, and it's opening doors to people, for people. It's about opportunities. It's about helping people. And they ignore the sacrifice. They ignore the destruction. That's not the story that's told. But at the end, what altruism really is about is the destruction. What the end altruism is really about is the sacrifice. At the end, what altruism is really about is the pure selflessness. But that's not what they lead with. That's not the story that they actually tell, because people won't buy it if they tell that story. Alex asks, have I read James Clavell's Asian novels? He was an admirer of Rand, I know, but I also thought that Dick Strawn, the protagonist of Taipan, as a character you'll find admirable. I mean, I read them a long, long time ago. I mean, really years ago. I enjoyed them. So this is James Clavell's. He had a series of Asian novels. I thought the early ones were better, and unfortunately I can't remember the names of the novels, but I would recommend them. I would recommend James Clavell's novels. I thought they're all interesting. They are very revealing about Asian culture, and they also have to some extent at least, they view entrepreneurs and wealth creators admirably. Shogun was one of his early ones. Shogun was one of my favorites of his, probably my favorites of his. But Taipei, and there were a few, Taipan, and there were a few others that are actually good. I mean, I enjoyed them and definitely worth reading. Better than a lot of the novels you'll find today, and in some respects quite romantic. So yes, I think James Clavell. I also found them really fascinating because it was my first exposure to a culture I didn't know anything about, which was the Asian culture. And maybe Asians would argue about how accurate they are, or how accurate they are not. But they're worth a read. All right. As I said, tomorrow we're going to be doing. Today I'm going to do some sightseeing around Singapore, so I'm looking forward to that. Tomorrow I will be doing a kind of debate discussion about inequality. And then I fly to South Korea, to Seoul, where I think I've got, I don't know, maybe 4 different events. I'm speaking at a high school there. I'm speaking to a number of, I'm having lunch with a group of 10, 12 professors and speaking about capitalism to them. That should be interesting. I'm going to get quite a bit of opposition there. And after that, I will go to, that'll be in Korea, South Korea, and Seoul, and from there I go to Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, which is a whole other part of Asia with a whole different dynamic, and a very interesting place where I'm going to be speak at a conference there. I'm going to be giving 2 talks in Mongolia. So fiction book recommendations, new reader here. I think I gave one of my previous shows. I gave some fiction book recommendations. I can't resurrect that now, but I think I made a list of good fiction books. So I think it was the last time I did kind of an open Q&A, so maybe 2 shows ago or 3 shows ago. So go find that, I gave a long list of books that I liked. Also, if you read the Romantic Manifesto, you'll find a lot of Ayn Rand's recommendations for fiction, and those are the best. That's, you should start with Victor Hugo, and that he is the greatest novelist, other than Ayn Rand in my view, but Hugo is so much fun. It's so exciting. It's so stimulating. So please start with Hugo if you are new. To fiction. All right. I see we've already gone. An hour now, and I still haven't got to Game of Thrones. So we'll have to leave Game of Thrones. To some. I don't know, sometime in the future. I'm worried that the further we get, the less people become interested in Game of Thrones. But maybe in a future show, I'll just do a short show, just in Game of Thrones and my opinions of it. Maybe I don't know if I can do it tomorrow, but maybe even tomorrow we can do it. It looks like the internet connection here is stable enough. It looks like it's good enough, but it's I think Game of Thrones has some interesting philosophical. It's a certain aspect of life and it's the appeal of the show I find interesting and fascinating, and what makes it interesting. All right, and if the last final super chat questions, I will take those. But otherwise, I know I haven't covered in a while kind of what is going on in the world. One of the things I'll note, I'll just note this, the general angst, because I meet with a lot of business people here I met in Hong Kong and in Tokyo and here, partially because I'm here also from a business side of the world. And one of the things that I find really fascinating is the angst that really exists in Asia right now about Trump's policies and about this trade war with China. And it's real, and people are worried, and people are scared, particularly in Hong Kong, about what is going to happen. I think people still tend to be, I believe, overly optimistic about this trade war. They have a real sense that a deal is going to be struck. I am becoming more and more skeptical that a deal is going to be struck. I think Donald Trump has massive incentive to not strike a deal with China until after the election. I think he'll probably cut a deal then, but I think right now China is a great election thing to run on. Donald Trump needs enemies to run on. He needs to be able to shift the anger of his base towards the other. Donald Trump needs illegal immigration. He needs crazy leftists. He needs a conflict with China in order to rile up his base, in order to get people excited, in order to get people motivated, in order to be able to label all those leftists, what do you call it, globalists. That's what I'm called, right? And to do that, he needs enemies. He needs scapegoats. And China, China is a great scapegoat. It's a great rallying call to his people. And you can see, now Trump is also a mercantilist. He also truly believes tariffs are good for America. And now he's threatening tariffs on Mexico if Mexico doesn't help deal with illegal immigration on their side of the border. So basically, what he's doing is he's threatening a lose-lose proposition to the Mexicans. So he's basically going to raise taxes on Americans and reduce trade with Mexico, which hurts Mexico, but it also hurts Americans because it's a tax on Americans, in order to stem the tide of illegal immigrants into the United States. Okay, so I guess U.S. is going to impose a 5% tariff on all Mexican imports from June 10th. Tariffs has become, in Trump's world, and I think this he gets directly from Bannon and the kind of the economic nationalist people who he has surrounded himself with. Tariffs have become a tool of dealing with other countries. It's a stupid tool because, again, it inflicts pain first and foremost on Americans and by extension on our trading partners. So whereas trade is a win-win, trade with China is a win-win, trade with Mexico certainly is a win-win, trade with Canada is a win-win, trade with South Korea is a win-win, trade with Europe is a win-win, trade on automobiles is a win-win. Donald Trump is using tariffs. Donald Trump is using tariffs against our allies, against our friends, against our so-called enemies, against everybody, as both a foreign policy tool, but also because he's a mercantilist, because he really believes that everything Americans consume should be produced in the United States. He believes that we should have a balance of trade, which is just stupid and ignorant economically. He believes that we should be exporting as much as we import. I mean, he is the classical example of a mercantilist, and tariffs. I think somebody on the chat here says tariffs are a tool of the brute. Absolutely agree with it. There is no such thing as a good tariff. Absolutely, absolutely well put. So, I mean, this is truly insane, and I think that the markets that are assuming that everything, that this will all settle out, and ultimately Trump's a rational actor, and ultimately he'll cut a deal, and everything is going to be fine. I think is somewhat delusional. I think Trump is moving us towards real catastrophe, real problems, and 5% tariff on Mexico is small, and everything so far he's done is small too small to have a major long-term impact on our quality and standard of living. But over time, this is going to cost people. This is going to cost people. It's going to cost people in a lower quality of life, in a lower standard of living, in higher expenditures, and in lower economic growth, and in unemployment, and in real economic problems. And the problem is that it's very difficult to reverse. Because any president, let's say Trump loses the election next year, and another president comes in, they'll be in a very weak position to eliminate all those tariffs, because they will be viewed as weak if they do that. They'll be viewed as succumbing to the foreigners. What Trump has done with much of the American public, left and right, is legitimize tariffs. And it's not like Bernie Sanders hates tariffs. It's not like Elizabeth Warren hates tariffs. They don't. They love tariffs. Tariffs are a tool of the left, have always been the tool of the left. And now they're a tool of the right. So who exactly is going to eliminate these tariffs? How are they going to go away? The left can't do trade deals, because the left's trade deals, the left is, of course, the party that invented fair trade. So the left, because of the influence of unions, the left's view of a trade deal is, in China, you have to pay the same wages as we pay in the United States. Then we'll have a trade deal. The left's view of a trade deal is, in Mexico, you have to implement the same environmental regulation as we implement in the United States. Then we'll trade with you. That's fair trade. So the left has its own sick, horrible view of fair trade. So who is going to eliminate these tariffs once they get established? I don't think people realize quite how destructive and quite how damaging what is going on in the United States right now is. And a big part of this, and I've talked about this in the past, a big part of this is that the United States in the past has been a shining city on the hill, as Ronald Reagan described it. The United States has always been an example. The United States has always been something to strive towards. The United States has always been the symbol, at least, of freedom, the symbol of where we want to go for the rest of the world. And that is gone. People everywhere I travel now are cynical about the United States, are skeptical about freedom, skeptical about capitalism. If the United States has given up on capitalism, if the United States has given up on free trade, if the United States has given up, then what are we supposed to do? We are nobodies, right? It's obviously bad. Capitalism is obviously bad if the United States is turning its back on it. Trade is obviously bad. Trade must be a zero-sum game if the United States says it's a zero-sum game. It's truly horrific. And I'm, I know I fluctuate, and it's hard to pin me down. I fluctuate between optimism, because I see the success people achieve, I see the wonderful technology, I see the wealth being created, and deep pessimism, because I see what the intellectuals are preaching, I see what the governments are doing, I see where the world is heading, and I'm constantly torn between the pessimist in me and the optimist in me, and it's very hard to be objective about these things. It's very hard to figure out what are the dominant forces that are actually leading the world. So if you want my optimist side, then go watch my talk that I gave at Ocon a few years ago, the Rational Optimism. I think I gave it last year, but it's hard for me to sustain that when I see what Donald Trump is doing, when I see what the intellectuals are promoting, what I see, how people are responding to the United States. And I see the direction the world is heading, from China to Singapore to Hong Kong to Eastern Europe to nationalism and tribalism on the rise in Europe, to the mess that the Brits have done with Brexit. I mean, the only positive these days, maybe we will see, is what is happening, seems to be happening in Brazil. We will see if that actually is as good as it seems. We'll have to wait a bit, and I'll talk about that on some future show on the things, and update you on the things going on in Brazil. All right, we're going to cut that short. We're going to cut it here. It's an hour. I'm going to be picked up in half an hour by my host, and we're going to go do some sightseeing. I will maybe talk to you tomorrow morning. Maybe I will do Game of Thrones then. If not, I'll probably catch up with you guys from Seoul, South Korea, and you'll get to see a hotel room there, and maybe we'll try and do a show from Ulaanbaatar. Wi-Fi here is amazingly stable, amazingly fast. So in Tokyo, I had Ethernet connection, which is always significantly improved. But here I'm also using a very good camera. I'm using the Mevo camera, which I highly recommend. And once I figured out how to set everything up, because it was a little different in Asia. I had to put a little different address in Asia than I did in the U.S. Then the video quality and the video quality is good. So hopefully the sound quality was good as well. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please go now and subscribe to YouTube. And of course, those of you who support me, thank you for supporting me. You make these trips and giving talks to people around the world possible. You make it possible for me to do these shows from everywhere around the world, and of course from my home. So thank you for your support. Those of you not yet supporters, I hope you will come supporters one day. All of my intellectual activity is really these days made possible by your support. I get some funding for giving talks, but it's way not enough for me to do everything that I do. I very much depend on those of you who support me financially. You can do so by going to yaronbrookshow.com/support. You can also support me on subscribestar.com/yaronbrookshow. And I still have an account on Patreon because some of you will not leave Patreon. But now I feel more comfortable because I'm not dependent on Patreon. So if Patreon does something, I have alternative platforms. So please use those alternative platforms and support the Yaron Brook Show. You should, of course, follow me on Facebook and on Twitter. Just put in my name. So thank you all, and I will talk to you maybe tomorrow, if not in a few days, from Seoul, South Korea. Bye, everyone.